The Batman is out in theaters, directed by Matt Reeves, who has previously done films like Cloverfield and two of the new Planet of the Apes movies, which are surprisingly fantastic, by the way. This one stars Robert Pattinson, Zoe Kravitz, Jeffrey Wright, Colin Farrell, Paul Dano, John Turturro, Andy Serkis, and Peter Sarsgaard. It's the sixth live-action version of the famous comic book character, if I'm counting right. We've had two gothic Tim Burton movies with Michael Keaton in the early 90s, then followed by two goofy Joel Schumacher films, one each with Val Kilmer and George Clooney. Then the fantastic Dark Knight trilogy made by Christopher Nolan with Christian Bale, which has become the definitive version of live-action Batman, pretty much. And finally, Ben Affleck's run in the DC Extended Universe movies as the grizzled old Batman. This new version is a Batman we haven't really seen before, as it takes place 2 years after he started his vigilante activities. So it's not an origin story, he's already an established hero, let's say, but at the same time he's still very rough around the edges, he's still learning to be the experienced true Batman that we know. The story in the film centers around a series of high-profile murders being committed around Gotham City by the Riddler, a mysterious serial killer who seems to on the one hand have a personal game that he's playing with Batman, and on the other he seems to know a lot about the secrets and sort of behind the scenes details of Gotham's elites. Batman's investigation will have him form uneasy alliances with Jim Gordon and Selina Kyle, the Catwoman, in order to find the Riddler, stop him and learn what he knows about the city's sins and its past, which will also tie in with Bruce Wayne's past. So of course the question is, how good is it this time around? And that isn't a simple question for me, because I think that while there are elements of the film that I found superb, excellent, I think it is also flawed in some aspects, and it didn't wow me as much as I thought it would. But I do want to start with the good stuff first. So I think that the film, first and foremost, nails the atmosphere, the dark, gritty feel of Gotham, the presence of Batman as someone who inspires fear rather than hope, the dread and hopelessness and sort of gothic despair and that classic Batman should have and has been missing from many of the adaptations. I think in this regard is perhaps the best translation of the comic book's atmosphere to the screen ever. Specifically the first 20 minutes of the film, which are just top-notch. The terrifying introduction of the Riddler, followed by Batman's entrance into the picture, which is ripped straight out of a comic book, complete with his voiceover narration, which, by the way, made me realize that on the page, when you read his internal monologues in many of the books about the sorry state of Gotham and its crime element, he seems like a badass hero, but when it's done on the big screen, the first immediate thought is taxi driver, a crazy loner despising other people around him and, the whole city essentially. That was a neat thing which from the start drives home the point that Batman is not a well-adjusted individual. I loved the way that the film taps into horror elements. Both Riddler and Batman are terrifying in their own right. I also want to talk about the Batmobile, the chase scene with the car, in which that car is essentially a mechanical demon, an entity of its own, the way it's shot and presented. Just fantastic stuff right there. I also think it's the deepest we've ever delved into the character study of Bruce Wayne / Batman, into his trauma and the fucked up ways that he tries to deal with it. A significant part of the film is devoted to this exploration of the broken man that escapes his own emotional baggage, escapes from his emotional baggage into violence, which of course paints a much darker picture of the Batman character than usual. There's also the fantastic parallel drawn at the very end of the film, which I won't spoil. There's a realization that Batman has that really sticks the landing. Robert Pattinson is great in the role. He manages to be a very convincing Batman while at the same time exploring this character from a sort of new angle, doing something fresh with it. And in general, all the other performances in the film are very good as well. Zoe Kravitz is pretty magnetic as Selina, and she's got great chemistry with Pattinson. Colin Farrell is completely unrecognizable as the slimy penguin. I mean, the makeup department is just top notch, but also he changes his voice and accent completely. If you didn't know it was him, you probably wouldn't spot him. John Turturro plays a great mobster in Falcone, and Paul Dano does Unhinged like nobody's business in his portrayal of the Riddler. I enjoyed his performance because on the one hand he's full on insane, make no mistake, but on the other hand he's shown to be able to connect with people, to raise followers and unite people behind his mission, which is quite convincing and scary in its own right. On the technical aspects, the cinematography is great. Gotham is once again properly dark, rundown and dangerous, and the way Reeves shoots all these different sequences really brings you into the film, brings you into this world, this city, which is something that I think has largely also been missing from the Batman adaptations. We've seen glimpses of it. Well, in the Tim Burton's movies, he did create the gothic Gotham, but that was more Tim Burton than classic Batman. And then Batman Begins kind of tried doing that, but then departed from it in the later two parts of the trilogy. I think the closest thing to comic books has really been the animated series of Batman and the animated films that followed. But in live action, this is probably the best Gotham we've seen. And music, I loved Michael Giacchino's score, particularly the main Batman theme. It's very reminiscent of the Imperial March from Star Wars, actually. And in fact, the first four notes are exactly the same in both pieces. And it's such a fascinating choice to use this foreboding, menacing musical theme for your protagonist, because whenever Batman shows on screen, the music is playing and it's like the announcement of someone really fucking scary entering the room, which was certainly the intention. Great stuff. So with all these things being so great, surely the Batman must be a great movie by extension. Well, not really. At least I don't think so. There are a couple of things that I think are flaws and I want to point them out. First of all, the film is too long. 2 hours and 55 minutes. It's just too much. And it might sound weird because I'm a huge Batman fan, so I should be pleased that it was so long. But it did get tedious at one point. I think the story doesn't justify the runtime, or maybe rather there are so many elements of the plot that you need a lot of time to explore all of them. But I would question whether we needed to explore all of those things in the first place in a single movie. Why not just split it into two? Because there's the Riddler killings, the Batman-Catwoman dynamic, the mob side of things with Falcone and Penguin. There's the whole socioeconomic angle with the state of Gotham as a city and the reasons why it fell into such disrepair. There's Bruce Wayne's own emotional baggage that he's dealing with. There's the police aspect with Gordon taking on some heat in order to trust Batman rather than his superiors. And all of those threads are connected in various ways, creating this huge web of plot points. Now, I thought about it, and I think as a 6-issue comic book, as a comic book run, which is kind of like a usual traditional length, I think this story would have been just excellent. But film is a different medium, and as a film, it did feel overstuffed. There were moments when someone showed up and I thought, oh, he's still in the film, that's right. Or, oh, I forgot about that plot point until someone just brought it up again right now. I mean, the Riddler himself disappears from the movie for half an hour at one point. He's the main villain. That's not good storytelling, in my opinion. It's just a little too bloated and unfocused. I would have preferred it if it was a bit more streamlined, allowing me to experience the atmosphere without really worrying about keeping track of all the different plot lines. Also, the final act just rang hollow to me. There's this big set piece and a bit of fighty, actiony stuff during which I realized I don't really care all that much. I think at the point when it happens, because of the other stuff that already happened before that, which again I won't spoil, it kind of feels like when we get to the climax, it's not really a climax because none of what remains unresolved even matters anymore. It's almost like a weird epilogue of sorts. I don't know. I will say I watched the movie being pretty tired after a long day and I had a headache, so maybe it wasn't the right state of mind. Maybe I was too exhausted. Maybe I would enjoy it more on a second viewing. But I know that by the end I was like, whew, there's the ending, finally. So you may look at the good things I listed and the bad ones and still say, hold on, that's still looking pretty positive to me. And on paper, it should still be a very good movie. And I agree with that. On paper, it should. But I just can't help that. I can't help but feel that the whole is less than the sum of its parts in this case. That the individual elements are good, sometimes fantastic, make no mistake, but when they're put together, it's not a film that will be as excellent as it should be. Now, I still think it's at worst an alright film, probably a good one. I'm not saying it's bad or it's a failure. Also, take everything with a grain of salt because I had huge expectations, but for how good I think it should be, given the ingredients, it was slightly disappointing to me.